Welcome to the Craftsman Online Podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. The comments, opinions, and views shared during this program are those of individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, or Masonic authority. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmanOnline.com. Quick reminder, you can now listen early and ad-free with our new subscriber offer. Get the link to start your 7-day free trial in the show notes for this episode. You've joined us for an episode on Alchemy's influence on Carl Jung, and I'm excited to bring back one of my favorite guests. He's known as MJ Dorian, the host of the Creative Codex Podcast, but also we know him Masonically as Worshipful Brother Milosz Jeziorski. He's the Worshipful Master of Compact Lodge number 402 in Manhattan, New York. Welcome back to the Craftsman Online Podcast, my brother.
Michael, wow. Thank you. It's an honor. Always enjoy speaking with you about any topics, and very much looking forward to this one on two of my favorite topics in a big way, you know?
Seriously, Milosz, I am a huge fan of your podcast. I listen every week. What I love about it is the storytelling and the unique histories perspective that you get on art. And if you're not a huge art fan, totally get it. But Milosz does a fantastic job with the sound effects that he uses, the music that he writes, and everything that he pulls together to really give you that education that you feel like, wow, why didn't I learn this in high school? And we finally crossed a unique point during the year. This year, when you did a special podcast on Carl Jung, his Red Book, and Alchemy, and I'm like, oh, I know we got to get Milosz in on the podcast for this. So let's start with Alchemy. We know it's one of the oldest practices, dates back to Hellenistic Egypt in the 1st century. We could and we should do a whole show just on alchemy, but for the benefit of those with a loose understanding of alchemy, like myself, how do you explain it in simple terms?
Yeah, so that's the really interesting and bizarre thing about alchemy, is that it's a tradition that's lasted over 2,000 years. And because of that, it's picked up so many rich elements, and it's picked up elements from neighboring parallel traditions in Western esotericism, and it's influenced so much of culture in various ways too. I think of it like that it runs parallel to Western culture under like these cavernous passageways that continue to this day. And so the simplest way, though, I can describe it, I've written it down kind of in the most concise way possible. So I'll read this as my way of defining it. So alchemy is an esoteric spiritual tradition whose practice centers around the manipulation and transmutation of matter. It achieves this using processes found in nature, which the alchemist performs in a personal laboratory. Due to its esoteric nature, alchemical treatises and artworks are often marked by obscure references, metaphorical imagery, and a reverent spiritual tenor. So the main ingredient there, though, that separates it from all other spiritual traditions and esoteric kind of practices is this idea that the alchemist isn't just part of some philosophical tradition. He or she, because there were very famous female alchemists as well, they are engaged with manipulating matter in some way. And in the process of these transmutations, transformations, they are engaged in spiritual work. And the matter responds to their inner state, and they reflect on the way the matter changes, and they also, in kind, respond and develop themselves also psychologically and spiritually.
What surprises me is that alchemy and Freemasonry over time have been kind of intertwined because of some of the keywords that you just hit up: esoteric, nature, symbolism, occult, matter. And I feel like the myths that exist between the two of them that are symbiotic are tied to that. But then there's also some from the outside, like one that I've heard is, oh, alchemists are people who can take lead from a pencil and turn it into gold.
I love that one. I haven't heard that one regarding lead pencils yet. That's especially entertaining. I like it. I might steal that one from you.
Well, I think it's fair to surmise that what they're doing is trying to make alchemy seem more like magic.
In a way, it very much is within the line of a magical tradition, because perhaps we won't get into this quite yet, but there is an element of magic to it, the same way that ceremonial magic is a transformational process, and there's a spiritual element involved there that occasionally borders on creating something unexplainable, something that has metaphysical results. But beyond that, yeah, it has a really bad rap for the last probably about 200 years, a little more. So the way I like to pinpoint it is when Isaac Newton died in about the 1720s, 1727, I believe, his assistant burned all of his alchemical writings. Because it turns out one of these great early scientists of Isaac Newton, whose theories, we still use as a framing for our world view and understanding, he was a great alchemist. And he wrote his own alchemical treatises, and he studied the treatises of other alchemists. And so when he dies, his assistant burns everything he has that's related to alchemy, including his own personal writings, out of fear from the stigma that alchemy had at the time and still has today as this woo-woo, misguided form of early chemistry that was only about the greed of attaining a piece of gold that then one can sell off or trick others with. But obviously, as one actually looks at it in a sober way, there's a lot there that is very interesting, very philosophical, but also has these metaphysical elements that are very difficult to pin down and explain without trying it, or at least reading someone's experiences who has tried it.
We should be fair too. The series that you have on the podcast really has a couple episodes on Carl Jung. You get into the Red Book. You even talk about this in other episodes. Like, hey, if you haven't heard this yet, go back and listen to it. Milosz, when you started to really research into Carl Jung, the Red Book, Alchemy, and Freemasonry, and I realized that it didn't come in that order, but what surprised you the most when you started investigating Jung and how he was applying what he was learning to his work?
Right. Well, part of what surprised me is that, again, seeing him in the historical context, you realize that in the early 1900s, alchemy was relegated to the trash heap of history. It really was. And one of Jung's colleagues, Marie-Louise von Franz, who was a great analyst in her own right and an author, she says she calls it the dung heap of history. And no one was studying it, no one was writing it, no one was trying to translate these alchemical treatises in the early 1900s, because as we said, for 200 years, all the minds and intellectuals of our Western culture were like, this thing is just a stupid pastime of greedy medieval people. Why would we even waste any time on taking a scholarly interest in it? So the fact that he started to stumble on it and see these echoes of what he was doing and developing in his own psychology and his research and his theories, he started to see these echoes within the alchemical art, within these treatises that he was reading, within the way they speak about revelatory dreams in these alchemical treatises. That there's a lot there, and there was enough there that he started to see traditions like Gnosticism and alchemy as a precursor to psychology and a precursor to his form of psychology called analytical psychology. So that's partly what surprised me, was that he had, the guts to say, I'm going to spend an insurmountable amount of time translating these texts and finding an assistant to do so, even though everybody else says this thing is garbage.
What I also enjoyed about your podcast episode is you start to talk about dreams and how Carl Jung and his mentor, Freud, really got into discussing that dreams were less of these fairy tale painted, like almost like Disney movies that were happening in your mind while we're sleeping, but really more a way of your subconscious mind trying to communicate with your conscious mind and make a connection. Mm-hmm. And that the images are much like our Masonic ritual, kind of like allegory pieces. So the things that we're seeing in our dreams are just representations that our subconscious mind is manifesting, so that somehow our conscious mind can define this and understand it.
Right.
So if I'm having a dream about you, I'm not necessarily having a dream about Milosz, one of my favorite brothers down in Manhattan. I'm having a dream about what you would symbolically represent.
Yeah, no, it is very bizarre. And when you start to take your dreams seriously, as these traditions do, and inform you to take this kind of outlook on them, you start to realize that, yeah, the unconscious, its language is symbols, and it takes that and multiplies it in everything, in every way. So in a dream, let's say like you're describing, uh, it sees everything symbolically, and so it represents it that way. And you could argue, this is where the importance of Mason's symbols come from. It's a way of communicating with the unconscious. But in a dream, the characters that you see, they're not just the characters as they're represented in the real world. Everything you see in a dream and interact with, and the situations and even the environments, they represent a part of you. So if you ever saw me in a dream, the question wouldn't be, what am I doing? Should I call Milosz, see what he's up to? Maybe that would be interesting. But what a Jungian analyst would recommend would be, well, what does he represent in you? What part of you is he? And what is that part doing lately? Is it in turmoil? Are you avoiding that part? Are you ignoring it? Is there something going on that's maybe there's a conflict with that part? So it's almost like looking at these characters as, which part of me is that? And you start to realize that, oh, I'm seeing this theater playing out every night in my mind. And it's my unconscious just showing me all the various influences that I may not realize, are happening in my life.
Oh, absolutely. Dreams to me are like the ultimate allegory. Any brother listening understands what I'm talking about when you sit through the Hiramic legend and everything that's happening there, and you're just overwhelmed, and all of these things have multiple meanings, to the point where I try in real life, before I go to bed at night, I'll take melatonin, I'll try to go to bed at the right time, I try to avoid watching TikTok videos just so that I can have good, vivid dreams and then try to remember them the next day. They're like my little mini series that happens when I sleep.
Here's a tip for you that I've only recently realized is incredibly effective and explosive in some ways. So one, just try to make sure you keep some semblance of a dream journal that you write in occasionally to show respect to your unconscious, that you're paying attention to what it's giving you. But then the other element, let's say like if you want to trigger something like what you're talking about, before you go to sleep, when you're just sitting up in bed, maybe, sitting on the side of the bed, just sit there with your eyes closed for a moment, maybe if you do a prayer or something after that, and say to your unconscious, give me something tonight that I can really chew on. Show me something like with a lot of depth that's going to make me think about. It's going to have a lot of meaning, and it's going to really say something about me. And I did this once, and the dream I was given after this was so packed with bizarre layers of meaning, and it was kind of like very much like a defining dream that surfaced a lot of things that I used to think about in dream and everything. And it was so packed with meaning, I haven't done it again since. Because I'm thinking, I still have to figure out this one dream my unconscious gave me after triggering that, after telling it, communicating to that in this sense. So try it. Maybe it won't work the first night, but try it again. Something will come up. It'll spit something out for you that you can really chew on.
So Milosz, I love having you back on the podcast because I think of some of our previous episodes where I think when you first came on, you were talking about the research you had done into Plato and the mystery schools and some of the secret societies and what he was bringing together there. And then we also did a great discussion talking about Western esoteric influences on Freemasonry and went really up into the clouds and had a great conversation on that. But this is the first time that you and I have kind of connected on alchemy. And I'm curious how you got into this, maybe if it enhanced your experience going through the ritual or the studies in Freemasonry.
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly been each one of these traditions that I personally end up engaging intellectually with. It just comes through coincidence, correspondence, just comes through seeing, several other people mention it or talk about it or a lecture or this or that. And then my mind gets triggered in these various ways where I start being drawn to the thing, usually because there's an inherent paradox or a mystery in the thing, like with Kabbalah. It's like, well, what are all these shapes about? What's this? Drop my pen out of excitement. What's this diagram about? With these orbs, and you start to get drawn into the paradox and the mystery, I feel. And with alchemy is very much similar. And honestly, the paradoxes in alchemy, they range and span out in so many directions that it's just so fun. And as an artist myself, just seeing the alchemical art and the woodcuts and the paintings probably was the first thing that drew me into it, because it looks like surrealism from 1,000 years ago. It's the style of like Salvador Dali, but it's like, what are they doing? Why are they illustrating a man presenting a woman with a toad that is then being applied to suckle on her naked breast? It's like, what? What are they thinking? What is happening here? What does this represent? And you get drawn into it. That was, I think, what took me in.
Well, one, I'm glad as an artist that sometimes when you see art, you take a step back and are trying to really figure out what the inspiration is or what brought that composition together. So that's kind of refreshing, because I sit there and wonder, like, am I the only one not understanding what's happening? But I would also say is one of the things in Freemasonry, especially early in the first degree in the New York ritual, is we're told that we're going to be challenged. Our thoughts are going to be challenged. Our belief system is going to be challenged, and that we should be open to accepting new things for the most part. And alchemy and Rosicrucianism are pretty much the two areas that I've not really gotten that into. But conversations like we're having as brothers gives me some confidence to think, hey, I could get into that, and I know someone who is following that path.
I would recommend, let's say, for homework, for any of the listeners or for yourself, if you wanted to just pick up or order one of these alchemical treatises, just to take a look at it. One of the most beautiful celebrated ones is called Splendor Solis. Splendor, same way as we spell it, Splendor. And then Solis, a Latin term for the sun, Solis. And there's a beautiful full color version of it you can order anywhere online, Amazon or anything. And the paintings in that are just so evocative. And they draw out so much out of you that you could really use them as these mandalas that you can meditate on too, in a sense. And then the other one that is just full of also very rich imagery and written discourses for each one, or each one of these epigrams they're called, is Atalanta Fugens by Michael Meyer. And again, it's Latin. Atalanta is a female name, and then Fugens, Fugiens. And this is also one of these celebrated works that a close friend of mine who is a modern practicing alchemist mentions that within that work is contained the secret of the work, if you know how to find it.
I noticed when you had talked about the Red Book, Jung writes about Sol, which is the sun, and Luna, which is the moon, which are alchemical symbols that represent consciousness and unconsciousness. Now, those in the know that have gone through our degrees in Freemasonry also are told what the sun and the moon represent in Masonic lodges and outside of them.
This is no coincidence, my friend.
And did you found that connection too?
Oh yeah, and others as well. So what's partially going on there, I believe, it has to do with time period. So when we're talking about anything from, the 1500s to the 1800s, where Masonry was really taking on very interesting kind of turns in its development, it's getting influenced by these parallel esoteric traditions, one of them being alchemy, for the very simple reason that the brothers that are participating in it are also participating in these other things, and they're really interested in these other threads of spiritual and intellectual pursuits. There's famous stories of even famous alchemists, one being Cagliostro, who in a Polish lodge in Warsaw performed an alchemical feat where he changed substance into silver, and it's written down because one of the lodge members wrote the instance down, the event down, and he describes it in great detail about what he did step by step, what he told me to do. So it may have been the secretary of the lodge because of the detail, as we know. But it's very interesting. These traditions run parallel, and so the idea of like the sun and moon having some degree of importance, just like in alchemy, there's definitely a thread there to explore.
And what about the relation where Jung talks about the interplay between conscious and unconsciousness?
Yeah. So the idea of the interplay between these two is at the heart of Jungian psychology. It's at the heart of Freudian psychology as well. But let's say in Jung, we can use this famous image of an iceberg. And so the top of the iceberg that's just peeking out, let's say 15, 20 feet, is the conscious mind. It's what you know, it's what you can quickly access with your daily thoughts. And then underneath the water, the surface, is this immense and vast body of the iceberg that's 100 times the size of the one that's right up top. And that's the unconscious. The unconscious contains everything in there, everything from your birth, essentially, because all of these memories become these residual echoes that you continue to react to. And they show up in various ways, and they show up even in, let's say, as one direct example, as motivations. So for myself, I have a motivation which is a need for approval. Many people probably have that in some fashion, but if I trace mine down, it probably goes down in to various roots. One of those roots being that I was an immigrant kid that came to New York City and started kindergarten here not knowing English, and so the idea of approval from the teachers or other people became an important element of my survival in a sense, because I felt like an outcast. But then you kind of trace it down. Maybe you could trace it down even further. You move it into other areas, and you start to realize that, oh wait, I'm still influenced by this motivation. Almost every day, the idea of approval from my wife, the idea of validation from strangers listening to my podcast, or being an artist and seeking approval from people viewing, my art, and how important, in a sense, that is to my identity. And so, yeah, it's the unconscious is this constant influence on what is happening in your daily life.
So you made another point, and I was thinking that when I'm in a professional setting, like at work in the office, and I'm interacting with a colleague or a peer, like you can tell how a person carries themselves, their actions, the words they use, the choices that they make, and how that kind of relates to their struggles in life or challenges that they're trying to overcome, their issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm very curious, when you're looking at another artist's work through your lens as a fellow artist, do you pick up on these points that, maybe is it a brushstroke or a color or a run and how the music goes, or just an image that they're using or a theme that's reappearing? Like, do you pick up on some of the conscious struggles or trauma that they may be having in their psyche?
I think at times it becomes communicated through a piece of work. But I think more importantly, the way I view it, and perhaps other artists do as well, is that to be an artist, you very much are a conduit of something. Jung would argue you're a conduit of your unconscious, and your culture's unconscious. There's not only your personal unconscious, there's also the unconscious of the collective you belong in, and it goes even deeper, even the unconscious of humanity itself. That's a different conversation, perhaps. But the idea being that you are always a conduit for something. Occasionally, that you're just being a conduit for your own personal, perhaps complexes or memories or traumas, and those are expressed, and that becomes obvious. But in other cases, like in the work of this artist H.R. Geiger, Giger, who was very famous for very dark, oppressive kind of subject matter in his paintings, often showing machine-like creatures kind of subduing humans or being in symbiotic relationship with them. And he was doing this in the 70s before this was even a thing on our minds. And so then you're like, whoa, this guy must have been freaked out when he was a kid. He must be traumatized. But I did an episode on him. I read his biography. He had a great childhood. None of those things exist. He was a conduit for this kind of message, for this kind of art,
What about the one artist that you had on the podcast earlier this year? I can't remember her name, but she's the one to do a performance art where basically she would hurt herself.
Right, Marina Abramovich, right.
That's her, yes. So I usually listen to your podcast early in the morning when I go for my runs. It's a great way to just dive in, and there's no distractions. All I'm focusing on is the road ahead of me. And I remember hearing the story, and I was turning corners as I was running my round. I was like, oh my gosh, this poor woman would get on stage and basically torture herself, which was a form of her performance art. Would you associate with her as a person who had trauma and this is how she was trying to express herself?
So here's a case where it does seem like, looking at her life and her own way of telling her life story, that yes, that there was a lot of factors in her childhood, in the oppressive kind of communist regime that she grew up in, and her lack of affection and and being on the receiving end of quite a bit of abuse from her mother, and her physical and emotional distance from her father. These kinds of factors where, looking at it as a biographer, as a potential armchair psychologist, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense why she would carve patterns into her stomach with a razor blade during performances to get herself to bleed in front of an audience. But there are definitely instances, yeah.
And this is where you would get my endorsement as a fan of the Creative Codex Podcast hosted by Milosz. If you are looking for something different that is outside of your normal podcast listening space, you get a little bit of history, you get a lot of culture, you get some great storytelling. It's all pulled together brilliantly with how he produces it. This is something you're going to appreciate, Creative Codex. I'll make sure that the link to this podcast is in the show links for this episode. But I find a lot of the learning that I do by listening to your podcast actually helps me in real life, especially with the relationships that I have with other people.
Right. Well, I did want to mention a very interesting point about alchemy and how it relates to masonry. Let's see how it's shifted my perception of it. And because these two traditions evolved on parallel paths and were definitely, masonry is being influenced by the thoughts and processes of alchemy. There's an element in alchemy where they work with these three principles they call them salt, mercury, and sulfur. And they don't just represent the physical compounds. They represent aspects of reality. So salt is the body and the physical element of anything in front of you. Mercury is the spirit, your spirit, and all elements of matter have a spirit as well. And then sulfur is the soul, the person's soul, and all living things, plants, the soul of plants, the soul of minerals. So in an alchemist's view, when you're working with these materials, you're not just performing actions in the physical realm, you're also performing it in what they call is the subtle realm. And in masonry, I believe when we perform our rituals, this is also the realm we're performing them in. This is why some people have Masonic dreams, in my view, in my theory, right? So when you're performing the ritual, everyone is in sync, and everything is set, everything is working perfectly, and that's the aim. I think we always unconsciously are trying to reach, is this idea that the perfection we have in the ritual is not just for the sake of perfection. It's because we want that impact to be felt on an unconscious level for the candidate, but also in the subtle realm, even more in that area where, as the alchemists say, the material becomes spirit and spirit becomes material.
So while preparing for this episode, I was surprised to learn that the Red Book was Jung's personal journal. That's how it started out. And much like one of my favorite Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Aurelius was really just recording his own thoughts for further inspection and introspection, where it seems that Jung kind of had the idea that this could become a book. So I'm just wondering, do you feel that Jung held back publishing his journal while he was alive because maybe he felt the content of what he was about to share was just too deep?
Right. I mean, this is a great question. And the fact that, the journal was withheld from public view or publishing 50 years, up to 50 years after his death, speaks to a number of possible reasons. But from those who were closest to him, their explanation, I think, would probably hold the most weight, and it was a very pragmatic reason, and it had to do with that he knew his stance in the world. He knew that he was already labeled by fellow colleagues and people who continued to follow Freud and disregarded Jung's ideas. He was labeled as a mystic, and they used this term, as a pejorative. This wasn't a positive thing for a psychologist to be a mystic. He was occasionally even labeled as attempting to start his own religion by creating analytical psychology because of the things that are engaged in this process, including something called active imagination and forms of meditation and things like this, and dream analysis. And so he knew that the potential of people then reading these things that he wrote in the Red Book, which are these visionary, meditative moments that he had and that he translated into writing and art, that would completely confirm all of their horrible theories.
Interesting that you put it that way, because some would think that maybe he was holding back his thoughts because maybe he didn't want his legacy to be tarnished. But it feels that really the contributions that he was making, his actual work, really helped future generations and only enlightened or enhanced his prestige. So I'm kind of hoping that journaling is on its way making a comeback. I know for myself personally, in my office here at home, I keep a journal of all the conversations I have with folks. I definitely journal at work. I'm a serious note taker. That's been helpful throughout all of my career. But I'm actually starting to thinking of doing more of a personal journal. Like when I was back in college, I would keep track of my day-to-day life, even if it was just a paragraph, not like a full page or anything. Has journaling become something that you are practicing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was already journaling, let's say, a few years ago. I was already keeping a journal, and that has multiplied into me keeping several journals for different purposes. So I have my dream journal. I filled up one already. I'm on my second one. I have what one might call my work journal. If I'm somewhere teaching a class, I want to keep notes of what the structure is of the lessons of the class, or who the students are, what their names are, and such. I have my other work journal, which is specifically for things related to the podcast and things I'm pursuing creatively. And I have my esoteric journal, which I use when I'm exploring and practicing various esoteric meditations or spiritual traditions that I personally follow, and you have to catalog and transcribe the experience in a very clear way, so that later you'll remember everything that happened. So yeah, several journals that I keep track of now, and I love it all. Honestly, I wish I started all of them sooner. I used to journal in the diary when I was a kid. But
my brother, it has been way too long, and we are not going to let more time pass until you come back on the Craftsman Online podcast. Again, I can't say enough. Please visit his podcast. Give it a listen. Creative Codex, MJ Dorian, better known as Worshipful Brother Milosz Jeziorski. Thanks again for coming back and being a part of the Craftsman Online podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Looking forward to the next time, brother.
A reminder that you can listen to future episodes early and ad-free with our subscriber offer. Get the link to start your 7-day free trial in the show notes for this episode. And if you've enjoyed this podcast and you want to hear more, you can tell Siri or Alexa to play the Craftsman Online podcast. We're available on all streaming platforms with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.